You scroll, you swipe, you consume. Every second you're flooded with choice, more than any generation before you. Yet somehow, in the quiet moments, everything feels hollow. You've chased freedom, but it's starting to feel like free fall. You can change jobs, cities, partners, identities at any moment, and still feel like you're going nowhere. That's not a personal failure. That's the world you were born into. This isn't a motivational speech. This is a diagnosis. And if you listen closely, maybe a path forward.
Let's start with a paradox.
You are freer than your parents, freer than your grandparents. You can choose who to love, how to dress, what to believe, where to live, and even who to be. But with every option added, something quietly disappeared. Structure, certainty, continuity. Zygmunt Bauman, a Polish sociologist, called this world liquid modernity, an age where nothing holds shape long enough to build on. Careers aren't lifelong, relationships aren't stable, communities aren't permanent. Everything flows, everything melts, and when everything melts, it becomes almost impossible to stand still. In the solid world of the past, you knew who you were by the roles you played, as a worker, a partner, a parent, a citizen. Those roles were rigid, yes, but they gave shape to your existence. Now those old molds are gone, and you're told to invent yourself from scratch again and again. To keep up, to pivot, to optimize. But how do you build meaning in a world that won't stop shifting beneath your feet? This is where the illusion of freedom becomes a trap. Because without anchors, without constraints, freedom doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like drowning.
Think of the ocean.
Beautiful, vast, full of possibility, but also endless, merciless, and disorienting when you're alone, far from shore. You may be swimming hard, but with no reference point, you can't tell whether you're making progress or just treading water. That's what it's like to live in liquid modernity. Everything is temporary, not because you want it to be, but because permanence has been removed from the equation. You switch jobs not for adventure, but because stability no longer exists. You struggle to commit, not because you're careless, but because you fear building on quicksand. In this kind of world, identity becomes performance. You curate your profile, polish your voice, rebrand yourself every few months, always adapting, always evolving, always slightly exhausted. And when you inevitably feel lost, the world tells you the problem is you. You need better time management, a new mindset, a new routine. But what if the real problem isn't internal, but environmental? What if your exhaustion is not laziness, but disorientation in a world that no longer offers maps? You've been told that you're free, and you are. But freedom without direction isn't liberation. It's just drifting. And here's the cruel irony. Because no one wants to admit they're drifting, we've built entire cultures of distraction to keep us from noticing. We fill every pause with noise, every silence with scrolling, every doubt with dopamine. And the more we drown in stimulation, the more distant we feel from anything real. This isn't a critique of you. It's a recognition of the tide you're swimming in, a tide that's invisible to most because it looks like progress. But if you've ever felt empty while doing everything right, if you've ever looked around and wondered, why doesn't any of this feel real, then maybe you're starting to see it. So if freedom without direction feels like drifting, what happens when that freedom multiplies into 1,000 choices every single day? What happens when commitment becomes terrifying and the idea of settling down feels like surrendering your potential? We were promised that more options would bring more happiness, but somewhere along the way, infinite choice became a different kind of prison. We've grown up believing that the more choices we have, the freer we become, not realizing that when every path is open, the simple act of choosing one can start to feel like killing off all the others. And instead of liberation, we begin to experience a subtle kind of grief for the lives we'll never live. In a single day, we can scroll through hundreds of faces, jump between job applications, change our bio, our goals, and even our beliefs. Yet with all that fluidity, a strange form of paralysis sets in, because when anything is possible, nothing feels necessary, and the fear of missing out becomes so overwhelming that we choose nothing at all. It's not that we lack desire, but that our desire has been hijacked by endless comparison, by the subtle suggestion that somewhere out there is a better option, a better person, a better version of ourselves that's just one choice away, if only we wait long enough or optimize hard enough. But while we wait, we remain suspended in the in-between, not fully committing, not fully withdrawing, and slowly turning our lives into a series of trial runs that never reach a final version. Jobs we don't love but won't leave, relationships we don't nurture but won't end, identities we try on but never fully inhabit. This indecision, though masked as flexibility, quietly corrodes our ability to form real roots, because the cost of constant possibility is emotional dislocation. When everything is provisional, nothing feels permanent, and when nothing feels permanent, meaning begins to evaporate. We've been taught to believe that life should be constantly upgraded, that every choice is an opportunity for optimization, and that if we're unhappy, the problem is simply that we haven't found the right input for a better output, so we treat our lives like algorithms, tweaking variables endlessly in the hope of a perfect equation that never arrives. But this pursuit of perfection, when detached from clarity and anchored values, doesn't lead to depth. It leads to fragmentation, where the self becomes a rotating set of curated versions, each one optimized for visibility but hollowed of intimacy, each one more polished but less integrated than the last. And when even our sense of identity becomes modular, when we are always open to reinventing ourselves at the slightest discomfort, we lose the very thing that gives life texture, the friction of long-term effort, the weight of true commitment, and the groundedness that comes from saying, "This is who I am," even when it's difficult. Because in trying to keep all options open, we unconsciously rob ourselves of the power to choose meaningfully. And the result is a life filled with infinite motion, but very little movement, like a person stuck on a treadmill that goes nowhere, exhausted not from the path they're on, but from the pressure of all the paths they're not. Eventually, we begin to notice the quiet toll, how our attention is fragmented, our passions diluted, our relationships shallow, not because we're incapable of depth, but because depth requires narrowing, and narrowing requires courage, and courage has become harder to access in a world where everyone is expected to be everything, everywhere, all the time. And perhaps the deepest irony is this: while we chase freedom through more options, what we really crave is something solid, something to hold on to when everything else feels liquid, something to belong to, even when the world tells us to keep moving, something that can't be upgraded, swiped past, or conveniently replaced, because real freedom isn't the absence of limits, it's the presence of something worth limiting yourself for. But once the thrill of infinite options wears off, once we've sampled, switched, scrolled, and still felt that quiet ache at the edges of our day, we start to sense that the problem runs deeper than just too many paths. Because even after we've chosen, even after we've committed to something, the emptiness doesn't always vanish. Instead, it often evolves, taking on a new shape, slipping into new clothes, whispering a new lie. Maybe you're just not doing life efficiently enough. And so begins the second chapter of our disconnection, one not driven by freedom or choice, but by optimization. We stop asking what matters and start asking what performs. We no longer wonder who we are. We track what we output. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we replace meaning with metrics and fulfillment with functionality. What started as a search for purpose becomes a chase for productivity. What once felt like a life now feels like a system running low on updates. Once you've been overwhelmed by options, and once the promise of freedom begins to feel like a quiet curse, the world doesn't invite you to slow down and reflect. It tells you to upgrade. It tells you that your sadness is inefficiency, that your confusion is bad design, and that your sense of disconnection isn't a sign of something missing at the soul level, but a bug in your personal productivity system, waiting to be fixed with a better app, a stricter routine, or a 5 a.m. habit stack. So instead of asking what truly matters, we ask how to do more of everything, and we begin to treat ourselves not as human beings, but as poorly managed startups, always on the verge of scaling, always needing refinement, always behind some imaginary curve that keeps moving just a few steps ahead. We optimize our mornings, our diets, our inboxes, our sleep cycles, our social presence, until even rest starts to feel like a task that must be tracked, measured, and maximized. And in that hyper-engineered existence, life begins to lose its warmth, not because we're lazy or broken, but because something sacred gets flattened when every corner of being is subjected to performance metrics. Love becomes another area for feedback. Friendship becomes networking. Art becomes content. And even solitude, the final refuge of the human spirit, becomes a moment we feel guilty for not using more efficiently. We mistake momentum for meaning. We confuse movement with progress, and we begin to fear stillness, not because we dislike it, but because in stillness we might hear something terrifying. The realization that despite all our systems, hacks, and hustle, we feel more disconnected than ever before. Because at the heart of this optimization culture lies a silent, unspoken void. A life engineered for peak output may be impressive on paper, but it often feels hollow in practice. It lacks poetry. It lacks friction. It lacks the mess that gives experience its raw, aching beauty. We've removed the slowness from love, the boredom from contemplation, the uncertainty from creativity, and in doing so, we've removed the very qualities that make those things worth experiencing at all. No algorithm can replace the way someone's voice softens when they say your name with care. No biohacking strategy can simulate the quiet fulfillment of tending to something, an idea, a relationship, a ritual over years, not weeks. And no digital metric can quantify the quiet, ineffable weight of being truly seen beyond your curated identity. But in the race to be more efficient, those moments become invisible, too slow to register, too soft to signal, too human to survive in the noise. So we build routines instead of rituals. We chase followers instead of kinship. We automate expression and call it connection. And at the end of another hyper-productive week, calendar full, inbox zero, to-do list conquered, we're left with a strange emptiness that can't be fixed by doing more, because it was never caused by doing too little. It was caused by losing contact with something older, slower, and deeper than efficiency. Something that doesn't scale, something that doesn't optimize, something that only grows when we stop trying to grow it. And maybe that's the realization we've been circling, even if we didn't have the words. That in a world obsessed with doing, the most radical act might be to simply be, fully, painfully, imperfectly human. When you've tried everything the world told you to try, when you've optimized your mornings, rebranded your identity, curated your entire existence down to the color palette, and you're still met with that hollow quiet at 2 a.m., the question begins to change. It's no longer, what else can I fix, or what's the next system I need, but rather, what can I return to when everything around me is in flux? What doesn't move, even when the world spins faster than I can breathe? And this is where we begin to ask, in a society built on endless motion, how do you anchor yourself, gently but unshakably? Before you drift so far, you forget who you are, when everything around you is shifting, when culture moves too fast to follow, when identities dissolve and reassemble overnight, when connection feels shallow and achievement leaves you empty. What you need isn't more movement. You need an anchor. But anchoring yourself isn't about resisting change. It's about finding something deeper than it. And while the world sells you fast fixes and instant clarity, the truth is far more uncomfortable. You don't find ground by running. You find it by stopping. And in that stillness, 3 practices begin to emerge, not as hacks, not as answers, but as invitations.
The first is, return to what is embodied. In a digital age where so much of life happens in abstraction, one of the most radical things you can do is remember your body. Walk without your phone. Cook something from scratch with your hands. Sit in silence and listen, not to a podcast, not to advice, but to the tension in your own shoulders, to the way your breath changes when you're alone with no task to perform. Your body doesn't speak in language. It speaks in sensation, in presence, in pain. And when your world is spinning too fast, it's often your body, not your mind, that knows first that something is off. By returning to it, you're not escaping the modern world. You're grounding yourself in the one place no algorithm can touch. The second is, reclaim ritual over routine. A routine gets things done. A ritual gives things meaning. The difference is subtle but profound. You can wake up, drink your coffee, scroll your feed, and go through the day on autopilot. Or you can wake up, light a candle, speak aloud a word that matters to you, and drink your coffee slowly enough to actually taste it. A ritual doesn't require religion. It requires intention. It says, this moment matters, not because it's productive, but because I choose to be here for it. When everything feels fluid and weightless, ritual gives form and gravity. It's the difference between drifting through your life and inhabiting it. The third is, commit to something that doesn't scale. In a world obsessed with growth, virality, and reach, choose something small, slow, and sacred. Plant a garden, even if it's just 2 herbs on a windowsill. Write letters by hand, even if no one writes back. Learn a song on an old instrument, even if no one ever hears you play. Because these acts resist the logic of the algorithm. They don't make you money, they don't build your brand, they don't optimize. But they root you. And in doing so, they remind you that life isn't a system to be solved, it's a space to be lived. Of course, these practices won't make the chaos disappear. They won't erase the noise or undo a lifetime of disconnection. But what they offer is something more honest. Not a way out, but a way in. Back into your senses, back into your body, back into something that feels, finally, like home. Because anchoring doesn't mean holding everything still. It means holding yourself steady, even when the world refuses to. When you begin to anchor yourself, not through noise, but through presence, not through speed, but through ritual, you slowly remember something the world had you forget. That meaning isn't given, it's built. Not in a day and not in grand gestures, but in the quiet act of choosing to stay with what matters, again and again, even when it doesn't scale, even when no one else sees it. And maybe that's where rebuilding begins, not with a revolution, but with a return. A return to the places where you can finally breathe, where your soul can stretch without apologizing, where meaning isn't an abstract goal, but a lived,
fragile daily act. So the question becomes, not just how do I survive the drift, but how do I build islands of meaning when the ocean refuses to calm down? Meaning isn't something you stumble upon accidentally, nor is it a prize awarded for efficiency, ambition, or moral correctness. It's something you gradually construct, often without knowing that's what you're doing, and usually only realizing it much later, when the pieces begin to hold together under the weight of your life. It rarely arrives in flashes of clarity or epiphanies. More often, it gathers slowly, like mist at dawn, around the quiet, unnoticed choices you make when no one is watching, and nothing seems urgent. You don't build cathedrals here, not in this era of fragmentation and velocity. You build islands, small, fragile, imperfect spaces of coherence that don't always make sense to others, and sometimes not even to yourself, but which offer shelter nonetheless. And those islands begin with attention, not the kind consumed by screens or analytics, but the kind that asks, what leaves me feeling more whole, even if it makes no sense on paper? What tugs at me softly but insistently, even when I try to dismiss it? What do I keep returning to, even when I'm exhausted or lost or alone? You might find a fragment of meaning in a routine walk through the same streets, not because they're extraordinary, but because they've seen you on days when you felt invisible. Or in a song you keep replaying, not because it's trendy, but because it speaks to something you haven't yet been able to say aloud. These fragments don't announce themselves as meaningful. At first, they simply feel honest. And in a world that rewards performance, honesty might be the most radical act you have left. So you start to protect them, not like trophies, but like embers. You begin to build small rituals that hold space for what feels real. Writing in the margins of a book you'll never finish. Making meals that no one else will eat, but that nourish you anyway. Tending to a hobby that doesn't scale, but grounds your restlessness in something tactile and alive. And while the world demands impact and reach, you choose instead what cannot be monetized, because somewhere, deep inside, you've realized that what doesn't scale is often what saves you. You begin to craft a life not from headlines, goals, or grand plans, but from small, repeated choices that echo your values louder than any statement ever could. The culture may not reward this. It may ignore you entirely. But that, perhaps, is the point. Because meaning isn't what happens when the world sees you. It's what happens when you choose to see yourself clearly, consistently, and with compassion, without demanding that your life become a brand or your soul become content. Over time, the repetition becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes structure, and structure becomes a kind of truth, not universal, not absolute, but personal, earned, and real. You begin to understand that your life is a myth, not in the sense of fiction, but in the older sense of mythos, a story that orders your chaos, that binds your memories, that makes your existence legible, at least to you. And no, it doesn't look impressive from the outside, but that's because it's not a performance. It's a shelter. It's an island. You return to it when the waves rise. You rebuild it after each storm. You light a small fire on its shore, not to draw a crowd, but to remind yourself that even here, even now, you're still capable of warmth. And maybe, just maybe, if you stay long enough, others might come. Not because you marketed it well, but because you made something real in a world that's starving for it. Maybe the world doesn't need more polished certainty. Maybe what it needs are more people who are willing to build small islands of meaning, quietly, stubbornly, and with care. People who know that you can't rescue everyone from the tide, but you can offer a place to rest for those who are drowning nearby. And maybe that's enough. Not to fix the world, but to belong to it again. Because perhaps what the modern world has forgotten isn't just how to speak, but how to listen, how to sit in silence long enough for the real questions to rise, and how to let those questions linger without demanding they resolve. And while society accelerates, demanding you move faster, respond quicker, and produce endlessly, there's something quietly defiant about slowing down, not to escape, but to pay attention to the details, to the moments, to the lives unfolding just beyond the noise. You begin to understand that not everything important announces itself with urgency, and not every truth needs to be articulated, to be lived. Some things are sacred precisely because they are hard to name, yet impossible to ignore. So rather than shouting into the void, you choose instead to build something solid under your feet, rooted not in confidence, but in care, not in visibility, but in presence. And although the ocean of uncertainty may never fully recede, you learn to live within it, not by mastering the waves, but by learning when to float, when to swim, and when simply to stay still and breathe. Because even if the world never slows down, you can. And maybe that is where meaning truly begins. If something in this video resonated with you, if a line lingered or a thought stayed with you longer than you expected, then maybe this is one of those islands too. You don't have to build yours alone. This space exists for people like you, those searching quietly, thinking deeply, trying to rebuild something meaningful, piece by piece. If you'd like to walk further with us, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Not because of the algorithm, but because sometimes you might need a reminder that you're not the only one building in the dark. We'll be here, one island at a time.